All right, so you guys really piled on the request for this one, Shane Gillis. Huh. Well, let's see what we can dig up, shall we? Comedian, podcaster, that whole SNL thing. You send us everything. Wikipedia, entertainment sites, bios, even his own website. Like, we're talking a mountain of material.
A puzzle of perception. I like that. We're going to have to sort through a lot of opinions to get to the truth here.
Exactly. Is he a comedic genius, or is there something a little more calculated going on? Gifted or grifter? That's the question.
The million-dollar question, it seems. And with this much info, we should at least be able to get a little bit closer to the answer.
Okay, so let's start with just the basics. Shane Gillis, born 1987, Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. Youngest of 3 kids, Irish Catholic family. Dad was a pipe fitter. Mom stayed home. Pretty traditional upbringing, at least according to his bio on his website, shaneandgillis.com. Oh, and he played football in high school. Trinity High and Camp Hill.
Interesting. You know that work ethic theme that comes up in his bio? It's all over these sources, even beyond his own website, like biowikis.com and starktimes.com. They both make it sound like this central part of who he is. Now, the question is that genuine, or is it part of a carefully crafted persona?
Well, an image is everything, right? Especially in the world of entertainment. So let's fast forward a bit. Gillis starts doing stand-up in 2012, right there in his hometown, Harrisburg. By 2016, he's moved to Philly, working on his act at Helium Comedy Club.
Yeah.
And he wins their Philly's Funniest competition that same year.
And that's a big deal. That win gets him noticed. Starts opening doors to gigs in New York. LA, thecityceleb.com even mentions him as one of Comedy Central's Up Next comics for Clusterfest in 2019. So yeah, definitely on the rise, talent's being recognized. But hold on, this is also the same year that whole SNL controversy explodes.
Okay, before we get into all that, did you see this podcast he started with Matt McCusker back in 2016, Matt and Shane's Secret Podcast?
Oh yeah, I dug into that one. A lot of the sources point to it as being pretty key to building his initial fan base. Lots of unfiltered, raw conversations. Catergreen.org described it as super popular. But the name itself is interesting, don't you think? Secret. Like, there was an awareness from the start that they were pushing boundaries.
Ooh, foreshadowing. I like it. Okay, so we've got this rising comedian building a following with a podcast that's maybe a little too secret for its own good. And then, boom, September 2019, he gets announced as a new cast member on SNL. But of course, the internet does what the internet does, and it all blows up.
It all goes sideways. And we're not just talking about a few off-color jokes here. I mean, the Mary Sue Vox time, they all go into detail about the remarks he made. Straight-up slurs, targeting Chinese people, other comedians. And what's really important is how SNL responded. They put out a statement emphasizing diversity, inclusivity. It's like they were drawing a line in the sand. Creative freedom, yes. But there are limits.
And he crossed him fired before he even gets to appear in one sketch.
Gone, just like that.
Wow. But he doesn't just disappear, does he?
Not at all. In fact, this is where the grifter or gifted question gets really, really interesting, because so many sources describe him doubling down, refusing to apologize, claiming his words were taken out of context, and he starts to frame himself as a victim of this cancel culture.
So is that genuine defiance? Or is it a calculated move to appeal to a certain audience? Because let's be honest, anti-woke, canceled comedian, that's a brand for some people.
It is. And his career post-SNL, well, it's actually pretty impressive. He keeps podcasting, touring, puts out 2 Netflix specials, Shane Gillis, live in Austin in 2021, and then Shane Gillis, Beautiful Dogs, just this year. He even lands a recurring role on Peacock's Bupkes and co-stars in Tires, the Netflix series that he and Matt McCusker created.
So on the surface, he's thriving. But that question just keeps hanging around. Is this pure talent, or is he playing a very savvy game, leveraging controversy to his advantage?
And that's a question we're going to try and answer.
Yeah.
It really is. It's like this weird gray area, you know? Yeah. Where does pushing boundaries cross over into something more intentional? Like, it makes me think about some of the other comedians he said he admires. Like Louis C.K., who's obviously had his own share of controversy. Some people see Louis C.K. as a genius, right? But others see someone who abused his power. I think that same debate kind of follows Gillis around.
It's like there are 2 Shane Gillises. The kid from small-town Pennsylvania with those blue-collar roots. Everyone talks about his work ethic. But then you got this other Shane Gillis, the one who seems comfortable using slurs, punching down for a laugh. How do you even begin to reconcile those two?
Yeah, maybe we can. Maybe that's part of what makes him so interesting. Right. People are complicated. Comedy's complicated. Where's the line between what's funny and what's offensive? It's not always black and white.
So we've talked about his background, his rise to fame, the whole SNL roller coaster, everything that's happened since. But I got to be honest, I still feel like we have more questions than answers. Is that just part of doing a deep dive? The more you learn, the less you know.
Sometimes, yeah. And that's where I think critical thinking comes in. You can't just accept things at face value. You have to look at actions, words, impact, and then make your own decisions.
Right. It reminds me of something we talked about at the beginning.
Yeah.
That idea of perception versus reality. Like, even if Gillis isn't intentionally trying to be malicious, that doesn't mean his jokes are harmless.
Exactly. Like Time magazine quotes this sociologist, Nancy Wang Yuan. She studies race and racism in media. And she makes this really important point that jokes that rely on harmful stereotypes, even if they're just supposed to be funny, they can end up reinforcing real-world discrimination.
And it's not just about race either. He's used homophobic slurs, too. The Mary Sue and Vox both have articles detailing some pretty awful stuff he said about the LGBTQ community.
Yeah, at a certain point, it's like, it's just a joke, doesn't cut it. If you're constantly punching down at marginalized groups, it's about power. It's about prejudice. It's about using your platform to reinforce inequality.
That's a really good point. Even if you personally aren't offended by a joke, you got to think about the impact it might have on others. Humor is subjective, but harm is real.
Right, and that goes back to what we were talking about earlier about intent versus impact. Like maybe Gillis doesn't set out to be hurtful, but the consequences of his words are real for the people he's targeting.
Okay, so let's take stock here. We've talked about his journey, the SNL controversy, what he's done since then, even his return to host the show.
We've talked about intent versus impact, the dangers of stereotypes, that whole cancel culture debate.
And we've seen how he's positioned himself as both a victim and a provocateur. He's definitely built a following of people who see him as this champion of free speech.
But you can't ignore the cost. He's profited from offensive humor, and that's contributed to an environment where marginalized groups feel less safe, less valued.
So the million-dollar question is still on the table. Gifted or grifter? Visionary or con artist?
Oh.
I'm not sure we're any closer to an answer. I don't know.
Yeah.
It's tough, right? I feel like we've gone back and forth on this one. What do you think?
Yeah, it is. It really is. One thing that really struck me, though, is just how much Gillis's career hasn't actually been hurt by any of this. Like, yeah, he got fired from SNL, but he's still working, still making money, he still has a huge platform. What does that say about our culture? What does it say about what we're willing to tolerate? Who we're willing to forgive? Who gets second chances?
Yeah, that's a great point. And something for all of us to think about, not just in comedy, but with all kinds of entertainment and media. What are we supporting with our attention, with our money?
Exactly. It's like this whole idea of visionary versus con artist. It's everywhere. You see it in business, politics, tech. People who are incredibly charismatic, they disrupt the status quo, but they might also be leaving a lot of damage in their wake.
So how do we as consumers, as audience members, how do we get better at spotting the difference? What should we be looking out for?
Well, for starters, I think you got to look beyond the surface. You can't just get caught up in the charisma or the controversy. You have to dig deeper. Look at their actions, their consistency. Do they actually follow through on their promises? Or is it all just talk?
And what about the people around them? Their teams, the people they collaborate with, their supporters. Are they credible? Do they ever raise any concerns?
It's a good point. It's like with any investment, you want to do your due diligence. Who's actually profiting from this person's success? Is it a diverse group of people? Or is it just a small, insular circle?
I think it's also important to pay attention to how they handle criticism. Do they respond with humility, a willingness to learn? Or do they just get defensive and deflect blame?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
A true visionary is going to be open to feedback, even if it's uncomfortable. They're going to be willing to acknowledge their mistakes and grow from them. A con artist, on the other hand, well, they're going to be way more interested in protecting their image and maintaining control.
So going back to Shane Gillis, how does he measure up against all of this? Has he shown any signs of growth, any accountability, since the whole SNL thing?
Well, this is where it gets complicated. There are definitely arguments to be made on both sides. Some people will point to his continued success, his Netflix specials, his acting roles as evidence that he's learned from his mistakes and moved on.
But then you have other people who say that his doubling down, his refusal to fully apologize, his continued use of edgy, a sense of humor, it all suggests that he hasn't really changed at all.
And that's where it comes back to personal interpretation. Where do you draw the line? What's forgivable, what's not? It's not always clear-cut.
Like you said earlier, there are no easy answers. But maybe that's okay. Maybe the point of these deep dives isn't to come up with some definitive conclusion. It's to give our listeners the information, the context, the different perspectives, so they can make up their own minds.
I think that's a great way to put it. And to encourage them to keep thinking critically about the world around them, to question assumptions, to challenge narratives, and to be discerning consumers of information and entertainment.
So in the case of Shane Gillis, the verdict is still out. Visionary or con artist? Gifted or grifter? It's up to you to decide.
Yeah, but one thing's for sure, he's a fascinating case study. The whole thing gets you thinking about the complexities of fame, ambition, and where's that line between pushing boundaries and actually causing harm.
And we'll be here to keep unpacking all of it with you. So until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep deciding for yourself what you believe.